We're going to continue today in Joshua chapter 22, a chapter that has some quite dramatic theological and practical implications contained in it. Now, I outlined for you that we'd identify four important questions, although there are more, that are addressed in this particular narrative. And the questions are, number one, who are God's people? Number two, where is the proper worship of God to take place? Number three, what is the proper worship of God? And number four, does our heartfelt sincerity and good intentions as believers trump God's actual laws and commandments? Now, these questions are broached in Joshua chapter 22 within the backdrop of an incident whereby 3 of the 12 tribes of Israel, 2 and half of another tribe actually, were being mustered out of Joshua's army and allowed to return home to their land inheritance that was on the east side of the Jordan River. Hence the academic name for that region, the Trans, or across the Jordan, the Transjordan. Now, on their way back from fighting in Canaan, which was just a short distance of a few days' journey, these 3 tribes stopped as they approached the Jordan, and before crossing over to their land, they built an altar on the western bank of the river. And when the 10 tribes of Israel, actually 9 and half of another tribe, who had decided to take their land inheritance inside the land of Canaan, in other words, the promised land, when they heard of this, they heard of those other tribes building this altar, they took it to mean that those tribes had either decided to worship another god altogether, or that they were establishing an alternative place of worship as opposed to the current one that was in Shiloh. Now, either way, this was viewed as an act of rebellion, and it so incensed the 10 tribes that they immediately decided they ought to band together and go to war against those 3 tribes who'd built that altar. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and Pinchas, often referred to, by the way, as Phinehas, who was the son of the high priest Eleazar, along with 10 head men representing the 10 tribes of Israel remaining in the promised land, they formed a delegation to go and confront the leaders of these tribes prior to battle commencing. Now, the 3 tribes expressed complete shock at the reaction of the 10 tribes and assured the delegation that their intent was to display unity, not division, and that it was their sincere desire to retain their common identity with Israel, and that's what led them to build this altar. And further, that while there was no denying that this was an altar that they built, in fact, they made the point that it was essentially a replica of the tabernacle altar, that they did not intend to use it as a sacrificial altar. Rather, it would only be a symbol. It would be a reminder of the common beginnings of the 12 tribes. The word used for characterizing the purpose of this altar was in Hebrew, ed, E-D, ed. And ed most literally means a witness. It is the same word used for a witness in a judicial trial, that kind of witness. Now let's reread a short section of Joshua chapter 22 so we can get our bearings. Open your Bibles, if you have a complete Jewish Bible, to page 264. 264. We're going to read Joshua 22, chapter 22, starting at verse 21. And we're going to follow it to the end. Starting at verse 21. And we'll back up and start at 20. I think that'll be easier. The families of the descendants of Kehat, who were Levites, that is, the rest of the descendants of Kehat, received the cities of their lot. Out of the tribe of Ephraim, they gave them Shechem, with its surrounding open land in the hills of Ephraim, the city of refuge for the killer. Gezer, with its surrounding open land, Kivtzaim, with its surrounding open land, and Beit Horon, with its surrounding open land, 4 cities. Out of the tribe of Dan, Eltkeh, with its surrounding open land, Gibton, with its surrounding open land, Ailon, with its surrounding open land, and Gat Rimmon, with its surrounding open land, 4 cities. Out of the half-tribe of Manasseh, Tanakh, with its surrounding open land, and Gat Rimmon, with its surrounding open land, 2 cities. All the cities of the families of the rest of the descendants of Kahat numbered 10, with their surrounding open land. So to the descendants of Gershon of the families of the Levites, out of the half-tribe of Manasseh, they gave Golan in Bashan with its surrounding open land, the city of refuge for a killer. Beeshterah with its surrounding open land, 2 cities. And out of the tribe of Issachar, Kishon with its surrounding open land, Dovrat with its surrounding open land, Yarmut with its surrounding open land, and Ein Ganim with its surrounding open land, 4 cities. Out of the tribe of Asher, Mishal with its surrounding open land, Avdon with its surrounding open land, Helkat with its surrounding open land, and Rehov with its surrounding open land, 4 cities. Out of the tribe of Naphtali, Kadesh in the Galil, meaning Kadesh in the Galilee, with its surrounding open land, the city of refuge for the killer. Hamath Dor with its surrounding open land, and Kartan with its surrounding open land, 3 cities. All the cities of the Gershuni, according to their families, were 13 cities with their surrounding open land. To the families of the descendants of Merari, the rest of the Levites, out of the tribe of Zebulun, Yokneam with its surrounding open land, Karta with its surrounding open land, Dimnah with its surrounding open land, and Nahalal with its surrounding open land, 4 cities. Out of the tribe of Reuben, Betzer with its surrounding open land, Yachtzah with its surrounding open land, Kedemot with its surrounding open land, and Mepha'at with its surrounding open land, 4 cities. Out of the tribe of Gad, Ramoth in Gilead with its surrounding open land, the city of refuge for the killer. Machanaim with its surrounding open land, Heshbon with all its surrounding open land, and Yatzer with its surrounding open land, 4 cities in all. All of these cities of the descendants of Merari, according to their families, the rest of the families of the Levites, their lot totaled 12 cities. All the cities of the Levites, 48 cities with their surrounding open land, are to be in among the lands possessed by the people of Israel. These cities, each with its surrounding open land, thus it is to be within all these cities. So God gave Israel all the land which he swore to give to their ancestors, and they took possession of it, and they lived in it. Then Adonai gave them rest all around, according to everything he had sworn to their ancestors. Not a man from all their enemies stood against them. Adonai handed all their enemies over to them. Not one good thing that Adonai had spoken of to the household of Israel failed to happen. It all took place. What a great promise that is. So the 3 tribes of the Transjordan make it crystal clear that they know no other God than Jehovah, God of Israel, and that Jehovah is the God of gods. And they firmly state that they had no intention of performing sacrifice on that altar that they built. Rather, the building of this altar was their attempt to show solidarity with their brethren on the west side of the Jordan and to create an insurance policy that they would not be removed from being classified as the people of God simply because they chose to live on the east bank of the Jordan River. Now, please make a mental note of an important point here. These 3 tribes could have built any number of other monuments to accomplish the same thing. Erecting standing stones as memorials and boundary markers was common among all Middle Eastern cultures, and the Israelites did the same thing. We read of it in the Torah in earlier chapters of Joshua. Why did it have to be such a sensitive thing as an altar, something that has such deeply religious significance for the Hebrews? Well, a very interesting thing is said in verse 28 that is translated well in some Bible versions, but it's not very well in our complete Jewish Bible. It says that the three tribes built a replica of the altar of burnt offering in the complete Jewish Bibles. Most other versions say they built a copy of the altar of burnt offering. The best one, though, the best translation, is the good old reliable King James Version that says they built a pattern of the altar of burnt offering. The Hebrew word that they're trying to translate is tabnit. Tabnit. Copy or replica is not the best choice of words to translate tabnit. It indeed needs a form or a pattern. And the original altar of burnt offerings is said to be a tabnit of the one in heaven. The rabbis and sages recognize the self-evident that the physical can only approximate the spiritual. Therefore, all that the physical can ever hope to do is to follow the form or the pattern of the spiritual principle it's demonstrating. So whatever this altar looked like, it didn't look precisely like the one at the tabernacle, but it did employ the pattern in the sense that it embraced God's construction instructions from the Torah, at least it did in their minds. In fact, it could easily have been far grander than the one at the tabernacle, probably was, from the tone of the text and the very harsh reaction of these 10 tribes. Now remember, the altar for the tabernacle was made of metal. It was made out of bronze, and it was portable. The altar that the three tribes built near the Jordan River would have been anything but portable. Probably was not made from metal, otherwise it could have been pretty easily stolen. Instead was the more typical stone altar. Now, I want to stop for a moment and talk about this in another light. Did the three tribes commit a sinful act by building that altar? Now, assuming that the leadership actually had no intent of sacrificing upon it or giving it some kind of holy status, had they done something wrong by building it? Now, I suspect if you asked a dozen pastors and clergy, you'd probably get a dozen different answers. Because this brings us right back to what I presented at the outset as the question that was so problematic for the modern church. Does my heartfelt sincerity, my good intentions as a disciple of Jesus, trump God's written and clear commandments? Now, even though on the one hand, the building of that altar was based on a kind of a selfish concern and an unspoken suspicion by those three Transjordanian tribes, on the other hand, they were just as aware of human nature as we are, and it worried them. These three tribes of the Transjordan wanted to continue to be counted as God's people. They wanted to be identified with Israel because they deeply valued their identity. They feared that not living inside the promised land with their brethren would eventually cost them their Hebrew identity. Times change. Political climates change. Leadership changes. New agendas, new alliances are created. Old ones dissolve. People forget. In only a few generations, they might be seen as aliens, foreigners to Israel. What might they do, they're thinking, to avert this awful possibility? Now, in so many ways, this narrative is prophetic of what actually did happen when Israel was forcibly exiled from their land, or centuries later, when many Hebrew families voluntarily migrated for a myriad of reasons to Europe, to Asia, to the Far East, to North Africa. It was never their intent that by leaving the Holy Land, they were also leaving behind their Hebrew identity or their Hebrew God. But in time, we find that those who continued living in the Promised Land denied that many of those Hebrew families were ever part of Israel at any time. Or they may have accepted that there was some ancient attachment, but now they see that those who live outside the Holy Land are lesser Hebrews, thus not meriting full consideration or citizenship as God's people. Now, as full of sincerity and good intent as the three Transjordanian tribes were, they were also within an eyelash of not only losing their Israelite identity, but of being destroyed for doing little more than building a stone altar. I asked the rhetorical question: did the three Transjordanian tribes do anything wrong in this story? Their good intent was to live outside of the Promised Land, which, by the way, was sanctioned by Moses, but also to continue to be seen as part of the community of God. They ignored the reality that it was Levites that were to handle all matters of public worship. They ignored that there could ever exist only one authorized altar at one authorized location. So they built an altar patterned after the tabernacle altar, we're told. But then they said it wasn't really an altar because they didn't intend to worship at it or sacrifice upon it. Now, I wonder how long it would have been before they did. Now, I can tell you with certainty that within a few years after Joshua conquered Canaan and the tabernacle and the altar were set up at Shiloh, horned altars modeled after the tabernacle altar popped up in Hebrew homes and in fields all over Canaan, because several of them have been discovered. We're going to find many prophets of the Bible complaining about this exact thing happening. And they warned, this is a great affront to Jehovah for people to do this. I want to give you an illustration before I make my point about the important God principle contained in this episode of Joshua. I don't know anyone who doesn't think that they are capable of controlling most aspects of their life. As humans, especially if you're a young human, we often believe we can do dangerous things and we can come away unscathed. We believe that while others might harm themselves, we're the exception to the rule. People who have become horribly addicted to illicit drugs, they didn't set out to be addicts. Most of them either believe they can mess around with these drugs and take them or leave them at their will, or they were so careless and immature that they never even considered there is a very serious downside lurking in the shadows of these powerful chemicals. I also have no doubt that the vast majority of those Israelites in the Promised Land who eventually built home altars did not do it with the intent to be rebellious. They didn't mean to upset God. I suspect many began with the same idea as these three Transjordanian tribes. The home altar for them was merely a symbol. It was a monument, they felt, to their faith in Jehovah. It was maybe the next generation or the one after that, I don't know, that said, man, it's a long way to Shiloh from where we live. Gosh, that's a long way. Why wouldn't God, since he's so loving and merciful, just accept my sacrifice here at my own home altar if he really is that loving and merciful of a God? That kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? He knows my heart. He knows I'm sincere in the worship of him. See, here's the thing that virtually every generation of God's people have struggled with, whether they are traditional Hebrews or they're Messianic Jews or they're Gentile Christians. All proper worship of God begins with obedience. Obedience based on trust. Even if the leaders of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, those three tribes, were fully truthful, they really didn't intend to worship at that altar, nor did they wish to change gods. They should not have built that altar to start with, whether they used it as a sacrificial altar or just as a symbol. By all we know from the scriptures, the three tribes' intent and their sincere desire was to worship God properly, to remain identified with God's people. The building of this altar was meant in their minds for good. But at the same time, the way they chose to go about displaying their sincerity was outlawed by the Torah, even though they modified its purpose just a little bit to kind of get around the letter of the law to their way of thinking. And you know what? It almost cost them their lives and the lives of their families. See, this issue of heartfelt sincerity trumping God's commandments to the minds of his believers manifests itself in so many ways. One of my pet peeves, because I think the slope is so slippery, and because as humans we are so predictable in our actions, has to do with Christianity's propensity to make symbols out of things that the Torah, including the Ten Commandments, outlaws. Now, before I take this on, don't think I'm judging you or accusing anybody of idolatry. But I am boldly saying to anyone within earshot that you may well have inadvertently put yourself in the same precarious situation as the tribes of Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh did, and you've done it in almost identical fashion. By means of using biblically outlawed symbols, albeit for a purpose that you see as sufficiently different from the prohibited one, so it should be okay with God. God says, don't make symbols or images of me, and don't make symbols of me or about me using earthly creatures. I didn't make the rules, folks. But we go ahead and do it. And we defend our action by saying that it only matters if we worship it. We can make a symbol, we can use it, just as long as we don't bow down to it. That's our rationale. The Israelites said to themselves, we can build these home altars just as long as we don't ever sacrifice upon them. Or we perform a kind of sacrifice that's maybe different. We'll do a sacrifice, but it'll be different from the one that's done at the tabernacle altar. So it really didn't count. The Israelites also said that in the name of peace and love and neighborliness, we could participate in the celebrations that honor our pagan friends. Their gods. We'll just go along with it because that's the loving thing to do. Just as long as we don't call that God our God. Their thought was that we and the people around us, our friends, our family, are strong enough to resist the urge to take it to the next level. Their conclusion is that it's our intent and our sincerity that God's looking at, not our actual behavior. Well, we all know where that led, but in a very few years among Israel. In less than a decade, in less than 10 years after this incident, we find Israel on a severe downward spiritual cycle. I mean, they're racing down the slope. In fact, that is why this altar incident is central to understanding the book that follows Joshua, which is the book of Judges. In Judges, we're going to see what happens among God's people when sincerity trumps obedience. When the thing that is dangerously close to sin goes over the line and it becomes sin. There are also other ramifications of that altar incident that are pertinent to the modern followers of the God of Israel. The problem of the altar was not only a basic theological one, whereby it appeared that Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh were rebelling against God's priests and his priesthood, therefore against the law of Moses. On a more earthly, practical level, the problem was that warfare was threatened because of the suspicion and the mistrust that it caused among the community of God's people, the 12 tribes. The 9.5 tribes were essentially accusing those other tribes of apostasy. And interestingly, it was not a matter of differences in religious doctrines. It was a difference in place of worship and manner of worship that was at the heart of the problem. Sound familiar? See, the good news is that we see this handled in a way that is a model for confronting the inherent difficulties that arise within a dispersed body that holds different perspectives. Rather than going to war, the accuser, Pinchas, listened to the reasoning of those accused 3 tribes, even admitting that to some degree it is the accuser who just might be in the error. A compromise was reached. A workable format of unity was maintained. Now the whole group, all 12 tribes, could continue to bless the holy name of Jehovah together and be blessed by the God of Israel together, even though they lived in very different places, under very different circumstances that would necessarily affect the details of how they practiced their worship. Now, what I've just described you is a pretty good picture of the church struggling to maintain unity in the midst of diversity. But it is also the struggle of a Judaism that on the one hand wants to be accepted in this Gentile-dominated world, but on the other hand doesn't want to lose its identity as the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and of Torah. Now, we don't have to read too far back into history to see division within the church that has led to the creation of thousands of denominations, most of which want little, if anything, to do with one another. Bloodshed, the Inquisition, religious wars. We see similar things in Judaism that have led to multiple divisions within the Hebrew faith, whereby some sects accuse others of not even being Jews anymore due to their unique set of doctrines and values. Now, most of us are aware that those Jews who accept their Jewish Messiah, Yeshua, are among those who are considered outcasts, traitors to Judaism, and thus have even been built into the laws of Israel such that it's nearly impossible for a Messianic Jew to become an Israeli citizen. As intractable a struggle as this has been within Christianity on the one side, Judaism on the other side, the unfolding of God's prophetic book in our lifetimes has suddenly thrust these two highly separated tracks of Judeo-Christianity together in a way that was unimaginable even when I was a teenager. We have Christians around the world of all faiths and denominations reaching out to the Jewish people. And very interestingly, the Jewish people are starting to reach back. This infant relationship is uneasy. It's full of anxiety. It's not always comfortable. Sometimes we don't know how to behave around each other or what to expect. Now, Christians are kind of like the 2.5 tribes that, although physically living outside of the designated promised land and outside of the formal community of Israel, we want our identity to be as the people of God. The formal community of God, the Jews, is like that 9.5 tribes that physically lived inside the former land of Canaan, now called Israel. They say that, they're not opposed to our living within the community of Israel's God, but it must be under the proper kind of worship. And they are the keepers and the defenders and the determiners of just what that proper worship is. That part of the Christian community, which, like Seed of Abraham in Torah class, seeks a close relationship with the Jewish people, tend to want to adopt symbols and traditions that are generally Jewish in nature, with the sincere intention of using those symbols to declare our identity and solidarity with the Jewish community. And just like that altar erected by the 2.5 tribes, by using their symbols, we Christians have built this monument of good intentions for all the world to see. But we built it on their side of the river. And for many Jews, that makes us suspicious. And we're not trusted. Some delegations of Jews have come to Christians and now understand we have no intention of disrupting or polluting their worship or degrading their symbols by our incorporation of them in our Christian worship, particularly as we have attached some new meaning to them. But it remains a source of trouble. And it probably will continue to be until Messiah comes and all human needs for symbols are gone. So this chapter, Joshua chapter 22, ends with the understanding that all is well and that those who live on the other side of the Jordan could identify with the God of Israel just as those who live inside the promised land. And just as important, proper worship was now also possible without the requirement of physical residence inside the promised land. Two very big principles have now been established. Very big. Let's move on to Joshua chapter 23. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, we're on page 267. 267. A long time afterwards, when Adonai had given Israel rest from all of their surrounding enemies, and Joshua was old, with age taking its toll, Joshua summoned all Israel, their leaders, heads, judges, and officials, and said to them, I'm old. Age is taking its toll. You have seen everything that Adonai your God has done to all these nations because of you. For it is Adonai your God who has fought in your behalf. Here, I have allotted to you land for inheritance according to your tribes between the Jordan and the great sea to the west. It includes the land of the nations I have destroyed and the nations which remain. Adonai your God will thrust them out ahead of you, drive them out of your sight, so that you will possess their land as Adonai your God told you. Therefore be very firm about keeping and doing everything written in the book of the Torah of Moses. not turning aside from it either to the right or the left. Then you won't become like those nations remaining among you. Don't even mention the name of their gods, let alone have people swear by them or serve them or worship them, but cling to Adonai, your God, as you have done to this day. This is why Adonai has driven out great, strong nations ahead of you. It explains why no one has prevailed against you to this day, why one man of you has chased 1,000. It's because Adonai, your God, has fought on your behalf, as he said to you. Therefore, take great care to love Adonai, your God. Otherwise, if you retreat, you cling to the remnant of these other nations remaining among you, if you make marriages with them, you have children with them, they with you, know for certain, Adonai, your God, will stop driving out these nations from your sight. Instead, they're going to become a snare and a trap for you, whipping your sides, pricking your eyes until you perish from this good land which Adonai, your God, has given to you. Today, I'm going the way of all the earth. Therefore, consider in all of your heart and being that not one of all the good things Adonai, your God, said concerning you has failed to happen. It has all come to pass. Nothing of it has failed. Nevertheless, just as all the good things Adonai, your God, promised you have come upon you, likewise, Adonai will bring upon you all the bad things too, until he has destroyed you from this good land, which Adonai, your God, has given to you. When you violate the covenant of Adonai, your God, which he ordered you to obey, and you go and you serve other gods and you worship them, then the anger of Adonai will blaze up against you, and you will perish quickly from the good land that he's given to you. As the book of Joshua starts to wind down, we are here given Joshua's farewell address. Joshua is giving this either at Shiloh, the civil and religious headquarters in this era for Israel, or perhaps he's called the leading men of Israel to his home in Timnath Serah, that's on the mountains of Ephraim, his tribe. I suspect it was at Timnath Serah because Joshua was now very old. He was approaching 110 years old. Travel would have been pretty difficult. And he likely would have followed the pattern of Moses, who gave his farewell address in the mountains of Moab. Now, giving an address on the heights of a hill was symbolic of the words carrying much power and authority, in many cases divine power, divine authority. Now, I have drawn the parallel for you in earlier lessons of Jesus' seminal speech that we call what? The Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Mountain, because it was given on a high hilltop overlooking the Sea of Galilee. I've compared that sermon to Moses' sermon. It's actually the basis for the entire book of Deuteronomy. The sermon that Moses gave on a hilltop in Moab, in the Transjordan. Moses and Yeshua's speeches were filled with new and wondrous concepts. Joshua's was not. Joshua's speech was a reminder for Israel to follow the ways of God already set down by Moses. Joshua had nothing to add to what Moses said, and he didn't claim that he did. He only meant to exhort Israel to do what Jehovah, through Moses, said they were all to do. Now, because the giving of the Torah, the law of Moses, was so central to all that would happen in God's redemptive plan, Joshua was emphasizing that just because Israel had gained a new leader when Moses died, and they would gain another new leader at Joshua's imminent death, nothing about the Lord's laws and commandments would be changed. See, this is a principle that is in desperate need of revival in the modern church. Because the only surviving part of that credo in our modern doctrine is that God never changes. Yet the never-changing God, we have been instructed, apparently changed his laws and commands that he said were forever. Suddenly they're not. Notice that even in Yeshua's Sermon on the Mount speech, when a great spiritual transformation was underway, that he too was careful to exhort his listeners to continue following Moses. Matthew 5:17. Don't think I've come to abolish the Torah or the prophets. I've not come to abolish, but to complete. Yes, indeed, I tell you, until heaven and earth passes away, not so much as a uterus stroke is going to pass from the Torah until everything that must happen has happened. The central message in Joshua's farewell address is contained in verses 6, 7, and 8. There Joshua pleads with the people to lay hold of what kind of a wonderful future awaits them. Grab it. The Lord will finish driving out the Canaanites from the promised land. But, here's the key, Israel must be obedient to God. And this is measured and secured by following the Torah. Joshua warns the people against idolatry because Israel's uniqueness among all the nations of the earth is dependent on their cleaving in faithfulness to Yehovah their God. And while the nation serves many gods, Israel serves one. And the way to idolatry, Joshua says, is contact with these nations that are still in the promised land and with those that are nearby. And this issue of succumbing to this horrendous sin is why Joshua says that Israel shouldn't even mention the name of their gods, nor invoke their names in an oath, which, by the way, was just a common way of making a contract. I'll carry some rocks from your house to my house, and you carry them from my house to yours, pagan neighbor, and we'll invoke it in the name of our gods. You see, the thing that Israel could not grasp even yet was that Yehovah claimed to fulfill all the functions for which other nations needed a multitude of gods to accomplish. Every nation outside of Israel had gods who were gods based in nature. They were gods of the various functions of the natural world, like rain and fire and wind and storms and fertility. There was a sun god, a moon god, a god of the oceans, a god of the rivers. The universally accepted understanding of the world in that era was that a person not only had to approach a god who was in charge of that particular function in nature for your need, but that every nation had their own and different set of gods to perform all those same functions. Man, there were a lot of gods. In verse 11 is the antidote for all the dangers that would await Israel if they should think to stray. Very simple. Love God. Love God. And at the risk of being a broken record, let me say yet again, the result of our redemption ought to be to love God. And the result of our loving God ought to be obedience to him. For God, obedience is the love language of his worshipers. While Joshua's message is at first uplifting, reminding all the people that God has fulfilled his promises to them at every step, and that God is able to, and he wants to, and he will fulfill all of his promises, what follows after that is a message of doom. Blessing's only going to last as long as total faithfulness to the God of Israel lasts. One's dependent on the other. If Israel begins to dabble in other gods, if Israel tries to behave like the other nations around her who do not have Jehovah as their God, then God will see them not as the generation through which his promises are going to come. Worse, they're going to lose their land inheritance. Back they'll go into the days of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, when they were wanderers that were looking for a homeland, when they were foreigners no matter where they set their foot. See, God's redemption can be taken back. God's inheritance can be revoked and given to a more faithful generation. See, this is a principle that as followers of Messiah Yeshua, we must always keep fearfully in the forefront of our minds and never get so comfortable in our relationship with him to think that God will not act to preserve his holiness and his justice, even if it means harm to us. This is expressed in a number of places in the New Testament. Here's one of them. Book of Hebrews, starting at 6:1. Therefore, leaving behind the initial lessons about the Messiah, let us go on to maturity. Not laying again the foundation of turning from works that lead to death, trusting God, instructions about washings and semachah and the resurrection of the dead and eternal punishment, and God willing, this is what we'll do. For when people have once been enlightened and tasted the heavenly gift, and they've become sharers in the Holy Spirit, and tasted the goodness of God's word and the powers of the Olam Haba, and then have fallen away, it's impossible to renew them so that they turn from their sin. As long as for themselves they keep executing the Son of God on the stake all over again, and they keep holding him up to public contempt. Pretty strong words. And here in Romans 11:22. So take a good look at God's kindness and his severity. On the one hand, severity towards those who fell off. On the other hand, God's kindness towards you, provided you maintain yourself in that kindness, otherwise you too will be cut off. The blessings that God has promised are more certain than the sun rising in the morning. Just as certain are that the curses that God has promised will curtail all those blessings and exile all those who serve other masters, other gods. For why, if you seek the blessings of another God, would the God you have shunned provide them for you? Doesn't even make sense, does it? Israel is without excuse. This generation who has conquered Canaan personally witnessed the Lord God drive out their enemies ahead of them, provide for their every need, and given them rest. Therefore, whatever rebellion they commit against him will be viewed as intentional and with direct malice towards him. If God is just, he has no choice but to act justly. He must destroy those who were formerly his, but who by their own free will have chosen to fall away. And we will begin the final chapter of Joshua next time.